Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Life Science Rundown. This is Nicholas Capman with the FDA Group. Before we jump into our discussion for today, just a little bit about the FDA Group. We help life science companies in the areas of quality assurance, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, commissioning, qualification, and validation, as well as pharmacovigilance. We offer three different engagement models, which are consulting, staff augmentation, and full-time employee recruitment. So if you ever find yourself in need, just head over to the fdagroup.com to check us out and get in touch. So today I'm speaking with Regina Atim. Hey, Regina, how are you?
Hi, Nick. How are you?
I'm doing
Nice to
great.
see you.
Likewise, thank you for joining. So before we jump into our discussion for today, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So I am Regina Atim, and I'm a pharmacist by trade. I bring a unique 360-degree perspective to maternal and perinatal health. And this has been shaped by my career, which spans clinical practice, regulatory, and industry leadership. I have also served as an advisory board member with the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, where I have worked to help shape some of the national strategies around medication safety. At my company, Clinicians Touch Healthcare Solutions, I collaborate with biotech and pharmaceutical companies to develop some strategies that advance their therapies through regulatory framework, including inspection readiness, human factors engineering, and post-market studies. So I'm also the founder of a maternal health company, which is developing a technology to detect cardiovascular disease that is acquired during pregnancy. And this is in our effort to try to decrease some of the mortality and morbidity that is associated with cardiovascular disease.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you for that. So today, we are going to be talking about how can the persistent exclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women from clinical trials, despite the physiological changes that significantly affect drug metabolism, be addressed to ensure evidence-based, safe, and effective treatment decisions in light of the FDA's July 2025 guidance draft guidance E21 promoting proactive inclusion and data generation for this population. So that's a mouthful, but there's a lot there, and obviously it's very relevant in today's day and time. So let's start by understanding the problem. So my first question is, what historical, ethical, and regulatory factors have contributed to the exclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women from clinical trials?
Oh, absolutely. So typically, sponsors and IRBs have defaulted to exclusion of pregnant women. And really, the reason behind this is having to do with the 1964 Declaration of Helsinki, which had to do with the protections of pregnant women and children that should supersede any other benefits that might occur. And what led up to this is actually two catastrophic events. One of them being the thalidomide event that we experienced from 1957 to 1961. And in these 4 years, there was a sedative that was actually prescribed for morning sickness, and it ended up having some teratogenic risks that we hadn't known about. And as a result, there's also another event, which was the DES from the between the 1940s and the 1970s. And this was a synthetic female form of estrogen that was prescribed to millions of pregnant women. And this was to prevent miscarriage and complications. But it was later linked to vaginal cancers, infertility, and structural reproductive abnormalities within the daughters that were exposed in utero, as well as males as well. So, what these two events taught us is really that there are some harms that can manifest even beyond the birth. And also the fact that special protections for vulnerable populations, including pregnant women and children, needs to be taken at the highest level. And research must be scientifically justified and conducted by qualified professionals.
Okay, awesome. Uh, Leading into my next question, how do physiological changes during pregnancy and lactation specifically impact drug absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion?
This is an excellent question. When a woman becomes pregnant, when I often present, I tell folks everything is upside down because if just to comprehensively describe it. But really, the physiological changes are that absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination are really different in maternal patients than your typical non-pregnant person. And these effects can also change by trimester. And the normalization postpartum sometimes can be anywhere between 6 months to a year after the pregnancy, the conclusion of the pregnancy. So dosing adjustments really need to be made in order to adjust to this. In some cases, you might find that a pregnant person eliminates faster, and so they might require a higher dose. And then in other cases, they may have accumulation or excipients that might accumulate. And so in that case, you may need to lower the dose. And this is especially important in cases where we don't necessarily understand. We haven't studied drugs in pregnancy. So in a lot of cases, we're going by a stratification where a risk-based approach where we have categorized certain drugs based on where we think the risk lies. And for most drugs, that would be a pregnancy category C. And what that means is that we don't know the effects, but we know that they're not necessarily bad. And so you have to weigh the risks against the benefits. Then you have your pregnancy D and X, which we know for pregnancy category D, we know that those are probably higher risk drugs. And so we have to heavily weigh the benefit against the risk. And in those cases, then you're having your healthcare providers really trying to determine whether or not they want to go forward with treating or with maybe holding that treatment or maybe switching it to something else. Then you have your pregnancy A and B. So pregnancy category A and B are your lower risk category of drugs. And those are drugs that we know to be pretty safe and benign in pregnancy. I would say Tylenol is categorized as a category B. And the reason that we categorize it that way is because it's been used in pregnancy for a very long time. And for the most part, it has been safely used. That doesn't mean that there are no risks. It just means it can typically safe, as long as you're dosing within the parameters, then it can be safe. And it's generally, considered safe and effective.
Mm-hmm. What are the known consequences for patients and healthcare providers when evidence-based dosing and safety data are unavailable for a population?
Absolutely. So the known effects would be either overdosing, which I just mentioned, where if a drug is not eliminated as much as well, or if the distribution is decreased, then that could lead to an overdose situation or a concentration that's higher than it should be, which then increases the sign of side effects. There's also the opposite side where you might have underdosing. So in pregnancy, a woman, such as the case that we're experiencing now with the Tylenol discussion that we're having, where it's one of the few pain and fever relievers that can actually be used during pregnancy. And we know that it's a category B, so typically this is the go-to. But now that there is some fear around some issues that may be arising or that may be that we're discussing, we think that this is, and we know that this is actually leading to some patients deciding not to take Tylenol. And there are consequences to not treating fever. There's things like spina bifida that we have to worry about, or it's the patent ductus closures that may occur prematurely. And then we also have to worry about just being underdosing and not treating certain problems that then can manifest in a greater disease burden in that patient population. So I would say that it's really important for us to ensure that we include some of these studies, especially in women that become pregnant during this study, where we monitor them to see what effects those drugs might have.
Yeah. And I think as it pertains to this specific moment in time, as we're talking about acetaminophen and Tylenol, there's a lot of confusion And even before we started recording, I kind of expressed that I don't even really understand what was trying to be communicated. So I would say in the short term, one thing that everyone should do is talk to their doctor so they can get the clearest and most accurate information possible as it pertains to utilizing acetaminophen for those that are pregnant. Um, yeah.
Absolutely. And if their doctor's not available, there's also the pharmacist that they can always reach out to that
Yep.
understand the metabolism of this drug and can really help to guide them and maybe steer them away from other more harmful drugs that definitely have some consequences within the maternal health space, like the ibuprofen and all the NSAIDs. They actually have an impact on pregnancy that is quite significant. And so patients, we don't want patients to substitute those.
Right, right. Talk to your doctor and or
Yes,
talk to a pharmacist.
yes.
So let's move forward. So, which therapeutic areas or drug classes have the largest evidence gaps for pregnant and breastfeeding women?
So the largest gaps I would say would be in the seizures, the therapeutic areas, you know, and HIV, so the anti-infective. I think that for drugs that are used in pregnancy, those have been studied. However, we still need more. But I would say that the seizures, which sometimes occur a little bit more often and or exacerbated during pregnancy, as well as certain infectious diseases like HIV.
Mhm. How are treatment decisions for pregnant and breastfeeding patients currently being made in the absence of robust clinical data?
Yes. So this is something that I experienced when I was a NICU and L&D pharmacist. What we typically do is we extrapolate from the adult dosages and then we work backwards from there. So what this means is there are really no commercially available drugs prepared for pediatrics simply because there's there's just not any commercialization. So many a times this leads to compounding that has to be done within the hospital.
Mm,
So some of it is dose related, where milligram per kilogram dosing, such as in gentamicin and vancomycin. But again, we're extrapolating from the adult dosages. And then in pregnancy, we're also doing the same thing where I had described the physiological changes where the ADME, absorption, distribution, metabolism and excretion are different in expectant mothers. But understanding that then we have to extrapolate from what happens within normal non-pregnant adults, it becomes difficult to get the right dose.
yeah, makes sense. So what barriers, scientific, ethical, financial, regulatory, currently prevent the inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women in clinical trials?
Oh, sure. So I think we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the Helsinki um, mandate. And I think part of the fear is we want to make sure that we protect expectant mothers and their babies. And when we don't know, the effects, it's hard to then include them in studies,
Mm,
which is I think is what has led us to exclude them.
right.
I do think that in cases where birth control measures fail for those that are included in studies, or where the women become pregnant anyway, that rather than discontinuing them from the trials, perhaps we could take a risk-based approach and maybe bring in some of the experts to help us to monitor these patients throughout and just determine, do they need this medication, and then probably unblind those patients and then just follow them and to study the effects of the remaining doses that maybe the patient will be taking. And
Mm,
if that particular drug is discontinued, still monitoring that patient so that that data is available. Whereas now, sometimes when they're discontinued, that's it. They're discontinued out of the study, and then there's no other data that is provided.
yeah. Well, that's a good transition into the crux of this conversation, which is exploring the role of FDA's E21 draft guidance. So, what specific strategies or recommendations does the FDA's July 2025 E21 guidance outline to encourage inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women in clinical research?
Sure, absolutely. So I would say that that's a great transition. And I would say that currently the E21 guidance states that we should be studying patients throughout the trials when patients become pregnant, or for certain drugs that we know are used in expectant mothers, we need to study them too. So we need to be recruiting those patients if we know that they have a high likelihood of being of um, of of essentially taking those drugs at any point. And so the E21 guidance really talks us through that whole process and how to go about, providing these studies and including these women in a safe and effective manner.
Hmm. How might these recommendations address both scientific and ethical concerns surrounding this patient population?
So we talked about the ethical considerations. We want to make sure that these conditions that we are protecting the patient and their offspring, that we are not putting them at any higher risk unnecessarily, and that we're taking a risk-based approach when we do include them in these studies.
Hmm. Well, it sounds like they're kind of opening the door for some reasonable and, to your point, risk-based approaches toward getting some more clinical data as it pertains to this patient population. What metrics or indicators could be used to measure the success of the E21 guidance implementation over time?
Sure. So the metrics that could be used would be how many drugs are on the market that are indicated for use in pregnancy, as well as safety data. In
Mhm.
our case that we're discussing right now, we're all trying to decide. We know that acetaminophen is a pregnancy category B, but the clinical data to support all of that is lackluster. Even though we know plenty of women have taken acetaminophen safely, so we know empirically then that it's for the most part safe and category B. But in the future, we would want to have some concrete data to support that. And E21 lays out the guidelines to be able to essentially set that up in your program.
Hmm. Set that up in your program. So let's talk about designing solutions. So,
Yes.
what study designs, methodologies, or safeguards could enable the safe and ethical inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women in clinical trials?
Absolutely. So for regulators and sponsors, you want sponsors to just engage the FDA as early as possible. So with Type C or the Interact program, this really allows for the FDA and the sponsor to agree upon the inclusion triggers, right? And then uh, set up those pharmacokinetic parameters as well as who needs to be involved. So is it maternal fetal medicine needs to be involved? What criteria the IRB is going to use to determine safety and efficacy, and really talking about a lactation strategy and post-marketing commitments that need to be made. So, not unlike other ways that we engage the FDA, we should try to do so again in this space in order to get in early and often so that you're guided along the way and there's a partnership there. And so both the Type C and Interact meetings are really part of the FDA's early engagement mechanisms that are used for drug developers. And these are all really good opportunities to get the regulatory feedback outside of the formal submission. So this is long before your IND, you can get a lot of feedback that can then help you through that process.
Fantastic. How can stakeholders such as regulators, sponsors, clinicians, and patient advocates collaborate to overcome some of these practical and regulatory barriers?
Yes, so that's a great question. I think it comes down to thinking of it as a partnership rather than maybe a traditional submission.
Mm,
We, at the end of the day, we want patients to have medications that are safe and also effective. We're experiencing really a drought and a desert for maternal and pediatric patients,
mm,
in that there's just so many drugs that simply cannot be used because they haven't been studied in these patient populations.
mm.
If we think about not only helping patients to have better, more treatment options to be able to navigate their disease or whatever it is that they might be experiencing, if we focus on that endpoint and work together to get there, then I think that that is something that the public would greatly appreciate, and they would understand that we are being a little bit more, I guess, open with them.
Yeah. Great sequitur into my next question. What role can real-world evidence, PK modeling, post-marketing surveillance, and observational studies play in supplementing clinical trial data for this population?
Oh yes, great topic. So I love the role of real world evidence. As I mentioned earlier, going back to the acetaminophen example, if we were collecting data from all expectant mothers on their use of acetaminophen, right now this debate would be no, because we as healthcare workers that are in the space know that, acetaminophen benefits far outweigh any risks when utilized within the dosing parameters. And
Hmm.
we also know exactly how it works. So if we were collecting all of this data, we would just have all of that now to sort of safeguard women and help the public to understand why we think acetaminophen is safe and effective. So real world evidence is really about collecting that data and getting that feedback. PK modeling and post-marketing observational studies are extremely important as well. I would say PK modeling is that much more important in pediatric patients and maternal patients, because then you can use models to predict what you think is going to happen, both physiologically and based upon more than just, say, the pharmacokinetics, but also based on the organ structure and based upon really just a holistic approach. And then observational studies, as I mentioned, if a patient is going to be taking a drug anyway, then it's incumbent upon us to really observe them and see what the effects are over time. That way we have that data.
Hmm. When you talk about over time, acetaminophen has been in use for more than 70 years. So it dates back to when it was first marketed in 1955, and
Yes.
its adoption into pregnancies was in the 1960s. So there's
Yes.
a long period of time that we have in terms of treating this patient population with acetaminophen.
Absolutely.
Um, Say that again?
I said, yes, absolutely. We know just from that empirical understanding that if there was a problem, that it would be very pronounced, much in the same way that I mentioned the thalidomide and the DES events.
Right. What are the advantages for sponsors when they consider inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding women throughout the clinical development process?
Absolutely. The advantages are really regulatory alignment and de-risking. So if you include patients early and often, then you're able to obtain certain signals that can help you to guide through the rest of your processes. So in a way, the inclusion of these patient populations right off the bat, can help you to de-risk later. So even if you find issues, you can then update your labeling to have those warnings and have exactly what circumstances you expect those events to occur. And the E21 really provides a clear evidentiary pathway, and following it really supports the smoother reviews and more informative labels, as I mentioned. So, if you get in early and you work with the agencies, they're going to be also incentivized to work with you. And that process is probably going to, go a lot more smooth for you.
Yep, 100%. I think this new draft guidance creates a lot of opportunity, not just in terms of capturing more information about the effects on, hard to treat patient populations, but also creates the capacity for us to have a lot more confidence in the safety and efficacy of these products in that patient population, and opening up the door for a lot more treatments to those that right now don't have access to them.
Absolutely. So things like clinical and marker differentiation could be an advantage, where if you're able to have some of the labeling with the doses and exposure and safety in pregnancy, that gives you an advantage and aids clinicians' clinical decision making, capacity and adoption. So, there's definitely some upsides to this as well. We know
Yeah.
that there's no drug that has no, that doesn't have any effects, right? But understanding what those effects are can really help you to streamline this process.
Right. And it's never black and white. It's very much understanding what is the risk and being able to take that into account with all of the other factors that are coming into a situation, so that you can make the best decision for that patient.
That's exactly right. And it's also a good risk management strategy, right? So if you have early signal detection, the agency is not going to necessarily come down harder on you with restrictions, right? If that they may deem you maybe did not disclose when you should have disclosed them, or you should have known. Even if maybe you didn't know, they might say, well, you should have known. And the only way to know is really to just go through this process and try to detect those early signals.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Regina, this was super informative, very timely. Really appreciate your insight. Before we close, is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, so, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about this topic. We decided upon this topic prior to some of all of the discussions that we've been having about the Tylenol and really acetaminophen. But that event and the events that are occurring now really underscore the importance of us collecting this data, and underscore why we need to take seriously some of those vulnerable populations that maybe we've been afraid to include in our studies. And I think if we take an approach where we're proactive about it, then maybe it doesn't have to be as scary. So I welcome this conversation, and I hope that the industry begins to sort of navigate towards this more streamlined process.
Absolutely. Regina, thank you very much. I really appreciate, again, your insight. And for everybody listening, as always, if you find conversations like this valuable, please share it with a colleague or your professional network if you have not already. Subscribe to get updates of new episodes at thefdagroup.com/podcast, and follow the FDA Group on LinkedIn. If you would like to connect about project or resource needs, head over to thefdagroup.com to get in touch, or feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.